Now to introduce Professor Tim Lang, Professor of Food Policy at City University of London. Tim wrote Feeding Britain in 2020, which hopefully some of you have looked at and read, and say what you're writing this big report at the moment. So Tim's going to talk about UK horticulture, its policy lock-ins, disruptions and options. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I felt I was going to be a bit of an interloper, but after the 2 morning sessions, I don't think I am. I don't feel so bad about it. So I'm very glad, actually, where's she gone? Rosemary. I was very glad that Rosemary invited me and the people of the AAB. I'm very different to, I think, almost all of you. I'm a social scientist by training, but in a weird moment in my life, I switched completely and became a farmer in very unpromising circumstances and growing field crops and horticulture in a hill farm or on a hill farm. So I have a very strange personal experience, but when for all sorts of domestic reasons that stopped, I switched back and have spent the last 45 years working on food policy. So I'm going to be giving you a talk from that framework. And Rosemary asked me to say, you've got no pictures in my slides at all, so you can just all relax and just fantasize about being somewhere else. And I always like it if people fall asleep in my talks, because it means my voice is nice. But when Rosemary asked me, I was in the middle, and it's got worse, of a 1.5 years work. I'm retired, so I should be doing nothing except growing plants for myself and my family and friends. But actually, I'm looking at basically thinking about food and the public if there's a war. So I'm doing an incredibly serious piece of work for a body you've never heard of called the National Preparedness Commission, looking at the public. What is the state of, my report is about what's the state of the British public's civil food resilience. Okay, so I want to plant a term you've never heard in your brain because I invented it for this report, civil food resilience. If there were shocks to the British food system, if there was a war, God spare us, if a pandemic occurred, that makes COVID look lightweight, which, by the way, is the highest risk on the National Risk Register, the highest, way the highest impact, highest likelihood in the next 5 years. I'm looking at, well, what do you do about the public? And the reason I'm doing that is because I'm a social scientist, so I'm interested in the public, but because I work in a public health department, although I'm a social scientist. So when Rosemary asked me to do this talk, I said yes, because it was Rosemary, because I was doing what I was doing, and then I've regretted it ever since, as one does, because actually it's really made my brain hurt. So I'm going to give you, quite unashamedly, some thoughts from thinking about the front line. I taught at a polytechnic at one point, so I learnt always put one slide that says your talk, and then you can fall asleep. And so it is. You probably can't read it, but so I'll read it to you. I'm basically going to look at what's the problem with horticulture. Why has horticulture not got this big profile? That's what Joanna was putting very beautifully, and Simon was putting very beautifully in a different way, and particularly in his answers at the end. Why isn't this the #1 industry of Britain? Given that food is the biggest industry in Britain. Food is the biggest employer. Let me just give you one, 4.1 million people. It's way the biggest employer, way bigger than the NHS, way bigger than logistics. I'm then going to talk about what I've called policy lock-ins, which I'm trying to push what Joanna was saying and Simon was saying. Then I'm going to look what might actually disrupt the common lock-ins, the current lock-ins, because in my report I'm doing at the moment, 12 hours a day, no breaks since November. I'm looking at disruptions. Where are potential disruptions? And then I'm going to say, okay, what does this do for horticulture? And I'm going to sketch some very radical futures. Simon gave one, what I call Dysonism. And then what do these imply? So is that all right? You can now fall asleep. And by the way, I've written it. But those of you old, we didn't do PowerPoint. You just wrote your talks. But I've done that because Rosemary wants us to turn them into papers. Okay, so point number one. Oh, actually, no, I'll go back. Let me go back. Let me just sort of gently introduce it. Essentially, food gets serious in Britain and in almost every country. The Netherlands, definitely the case. Russia, definitely the case. Latin America, definitely the case. China, definitely the case. I cannot think of any continent where this doesn't apply in times of war. War is the big shakeup when suddenly public health comes up, social needs become dominant in a bizarre way. And the nearest approximations to we have that, hoping that we don't have a Ukraine or Gaza situation, is that nowhere has that, is basically oil prices. When the oil prices went up in 2007-8, food and world commodity prices doubled. And for the first time, the British state, since 1973, entering the EU, and before that, World War II, took food seriously. Because oil went to $100 a barrel, world food commodity prices, which is only 10% of the world's food, only 10% is traded, went up. And Britain sent up immediately a Council of Food Policy Advisors. I know that, I was in it. Answerable to the Secretary of State, set up by the Prime Minister. A strategy development went on for 3 years to develop what should Britain be doing about its food system. Massive consultation. Forget Henry Dimbleby. Frankly, it was way better. And I know and respect Henry much, hugely. So I'm not being demeaning at all. Because he had to leave out some of the questions we're already talking about here, which is how much food do we want to grow? It was a total concentration. Look at Joanna, you're quite right to fix on the National Food Strategy, the plan. It's a brilliant document, but it doesn't talk about how much food do we want to eat. He called it the Tim Lang problem. It's not, it's our problem. What do you want from your land? What do you want to grow? What is it you want? The Netherlands is underwater most of the time. It's having to plan for water going up 1.5 meters by the end of the century. It's not long. What are we going to grow and how are we going to do this? This is mega stuff. And a system was put in by 2010, a national strategy that none of you, because you're probably too young, knew, called Food 2030. How many people remember or know Food 2030? Yeah, a few hands, exactly. You all should know it because it was a national strategy. And unlike Henry Dimbleby's, which was dismissed by the Prime Minister, this was passed and ratified and pushed by the Prime Minister. But it went when an election happened. That's what happens in the real world of policy. It was swept away. All of it went overnight. So what do we do with the realities of politics? Big P and small p. That's the sort of things I'm interested in, which is why, I was in at the beginning of the Department of Health creating 5 a day. Let me just tell you why 5 a day was created. It was borrowed from California because it was such a low expectation. If we made it 7 or 10, it would have been absolutely impossible to engage with the public. And that's why the Californians did it, and it's why the British took and borrowed it. So what Joanna was saying was absolutely right. It should be 11. 4 years of my life on the Eat Lancet thing. It's good for land, good for everything if we ate almost entirely plant-based diets, but we're not. So this is a complicated political world. Why do we use, in my world, we use this term lock-ins? It's because it tries to explain why do we not get what rational science says we should be doing. It's because we're people, we're not scientists. What's the first lock-in? The first lock-in that I see for horticulture is really abjectly poor policy engagement. We do not get the Secretary of State at DEFRA coming to a conference like this. That would be high political engagement. That would be interest. There is a House of Lords Horticulture Committee in Britain. There is the all-party gardening and horticulture group in Parliament. Those are very weak forms of lobbying. But meetings like this are not a sign of policy support. There is professional engagement, there's some policy engagement, but it's mostly moaning or whinging, or as a friend of mine calls, bleating from the edges. And I'm a bleater. I quite like sheep, actually. In fact, I used to be a sheep farmer, so I very much like sheep. The big change that happened in Britain was in 1848, after 30 years of barriers to trade, that the barriers were removed with the repeal of the Corn Laws in 1848, at which point British farming and agriculture went into decline, slowly, with technology, and entirely because we had an empire, and secondly, a very powerful navy. It went pear-shaped in the Boer War. The Boer War, a bunch of Dutch farmers, 250 years of Dutch farming, nearly took the British Army to the cleaners. It led to a totally Darwinian, in fact, racist, at some points, eugenicist debate to say, why on earth have these tall, healthy Dutch farmers beat these badly fed British? And there was a discussion, but stamped on. But in World War I, suddenly blockades occurred. And in 1916, a Ministry of Food was created, and it basically said, we've got to grow more food and we've got to take food more seriously. And 1919, the hideous end to the World War I led to, well, as usual, in other words, forget it. And the world recession, et cetera, et cetera. World War II, Britain, 1939, Britain was producing 30% of its own food. And immediately, if Nazi Germany had actually blockaded Britain then, as opposed to Britain trying to blockade Germany, which we forget about, which is what Britain did, basically Britain would have starved. But Lord Woolton bought the entire Canadian wheat crop illegally, without even consulting Churchill. Okay, one of the most extraordinary acts in food policy history. But in World War II, H.G. Wells wrote The Rights of Man, and the subtitle of that book was called What Are We Fighting For? It had to be something better. Eleanor Roosevelt, the president's wife, began the campaigning for civil rights that ended up as the UN Declaration of Human Rights the year I was born, in 1948. But most importantly, Beveridge, who we think of in Britain as the father of the National Insurance Scheme, National Health. Actually, he was an agricultural economist. He was the leading civil servant of the Ministry of Food of World War I. And he was brought back in 1936 to say, how prepared is Britain for war? And he said, it isn't. And he was ignored. And then in 1939, near panic broke out, and Woolton, who my mother worked for, a retailer, was brought in to run the Ministry of Food. And at that point, Britain took notice of food. There was a policy lobby. You get my point. So the weakness of the horticultural policy lobby is not under our control, but we ought to be thinking about how could that lobby be stronger. Let's do lock-in number 2. I look at other countries, even the Netherlands. I look at France. I've just been in Belgium, looking at the attempt to recreate regional identities in deindustrialized cities like Liège, Leuven, Ghent. These are very interesting cities. The Netherlands has a very strong horticultural tradition and has carried on in investing in it in a very big way, unlike Britain. How is that now turning? Well, actually, there are huge criticisms, even there, about what's going on. But there is a very interesting thing going on that the French, of course, identify with, and the Germans identify with, which is that you have food which is regional. It's part of your local identity and so on. We have no concept of that anymore. Even in my childhood, that had gone. I'm Lincolnshire born, next to the cathedral that is in Simon's University. That is nothing. How many people in Lincolnshire eat hazelnut, Lincolnshire sausages? You know, it's bland, universal meat sludge, isn't it? He says neutrally. If I had a proper set of slides, I now put up examples of what is going on in Liège or Grand Sainth, place that migrants try and come over in their rubber boats near Calais to Britain. These are council tower blocks which have now ripped up their land and their concrete, and they've got vegetable patches all round. It's almost like Cuba, when Cuba lost the support of Russia. They had to grow food, except in Belgium and in France, they don't have to grow food, they're choosing. So I think there's something potentially interesting about regional identity. A third lock-in. What would it take to get regional identity? A third lock-in is that basically, I work in education, I think we haven't helped. We've actually, the universities have declined the support for horticulture. They've cut it back. Why? College sold off. Colleges of agriculture that did specialize in horticulture incorporated into universities and put onto the RAE and REF treadmill of research excellence and impact. I go to other countries, or indeed I go to Wales in my report, and actually there's a very interesting circuit in Northeast Wales around Coleg Cambria, which is an FE college, retaining an interest in horticulture of sorts, but blessed by the Welsh government, which is absolutely committed to a horticulture. We don't get that in England. The promise of horticultural working party, a horticultural strategy, was promised 2021, reneged in 2023. Actually, one of the most useful things that came out of the Gordon Brown era, 2007 to 10, and the Food 2030 strategy that none of you, or very few of you, read or heard of, was a commitment to a horticulture strategy, and a roadmap working party was created. But unfortunately, it presented its findings in the new government, which, for better for worse, the British public had voted for, and it said we're not interested, so it just died. I think what we need now is a new set of agri-food colleges. I remember coming to Reading 50 years ago when I became a student. I'm going to be 77. So I've been around a long time. I remember those buildings, those wartime prefabs, which are now the art school. But they were the psychology department then. So I was considering coming in. I think we need a new generation of agri-food training, which actually links the practicality with the research excellence, the RAEF sort of stuff. We need, I think, and in my report I'm probably going to say, we need a new UK-style land grant system. How many of you know the US land grant system? Yeah, a few of you, great. Well, all of you should find out. This was created in 1860s under the Morrill Act. That every state of the United States should have an agricultural practical focus to encourage its agriculture, and within that horticulture where appropriate. I think if we don't get that in Britain, we will stumble on in a bad way. So I want that, a practically focused, not just elite focused. Lock-in number 4, again, back to Joanna. And indeed, what Simon was saying, Simon was rightly very harsh. Public wants cheap food. What do? We've got a real problem there. I'm not going to repeat what Joanna said because she said it very well. The problem is that we are ignoring the Eat Well guidelines. They're there, but they're ignored. They're not even taken seriously in public catering. So actually, the only slight argument I'd have with you, Joanna, is because I've been around a long time. I'm fed up of us saying, well, let's do it in public sector. Public sector is 3%. I'm interested in Tesco. Tesco is 30%. If we can't reduce the ridiculous 30,000 range of foods that Tesco offers and get it to be more like a greengrocer, we're failing. Now, even to say that, you'd think this man's completely loopy. Okay? It is unimaginable to think of Tesco not selling 30,000 different items and instead getting it down to 3 or 500. It stops being Tesco, precisely. Lock-in number 5. So in other words, this is fantasy world. I do live in the real world, I assure you. Distorted economics. Well, Simon gave his lovely example of the daffodil picker getting 7p. That's a lot compared to the veg picker. A lot. Farming gets 9 billion out of the 125 billion value added. The British spend £250 billion on food and soft drinks. Do you want me to repeat that? £250 billion. It's actually more now. So farming gets, and growers get almost nothing. Everyone gets it as it goes up, ever extending and ever accelerating lengths of supply chains. In 15 years, the home delivery, Deliveroo type, eating out, just eats type, WhatsApp, web-based delivery systems have taken in cash terms almost as much as farming. This is staggering. What leverage have we got on that, Jeff? If you're a friend with 1,000 acres, 0. That's the hard thing. So I hope you're not going to go and commit suicide. This is a very sober analysis, but it's where we are. Okay, what might disrupt this? Because I think the whole argument is this is now actually that model that's led to this bundle of contradictions and lock-ins is, I think, now fraying, if you want that analogy, and with great big gaps opening up in it, if you want another analogy. Well, the first thing that's fraying it is, or putting deep, deep tensions on it, is the environment. This year we've had, it's already the hottest year in recorded history. Last year was, and last year the wettest and the most volatile and the most unpredictable climate. This is nothing compared to the Great Famine of 1876. And that we now think retrospectively was probably El Nino. The British got blamed for it because it was massive in India and the British did not help in India. But climate change is now coming in such a disruptive way. All the assumptions of food supply chains is probably going to change. And we know it's not just about climate change, there's heat, temperature, but it's about soil, it's about life, it's about the biodiversity. And for us in Britain, it's water. Second potential disruptor, geopolitics. I work in politics a lot. That's what policy is about. We've seen the Crimean invasion. Well, the Crimean invasion has sent most of Eastern Europe into preparing for disruptions to the food system. Britain, nothing at all. There is no advice, let me tell you, no advice prepared for the British at all. The Netherlands has advice, the United States has advice, Latvia has advice, Sweden has advice, Switzerland has advice. We've done 10 case studies in my report. You will see them when they come out. We have major geopolitics, which is already affecting the choke points, what we in my work call the choke points. There are 17 choke points in world trade, and 7 of them are now active. The Baltic, Red Sea, Suez, Eastern Mediterranean. These are major points where world trade goes through. Things that the National Risk Register of our government, the British government, said are deeply unlikely, namely blocks in key ports, have already happened. Suez, closed by blockage, and a bunch of Houthis basically have completely restructured the market. Any of you follow Lloyd's, the marine? I'm joking, I'll be astonished if any of you followed Lloyd's. Lloyd's is the world shipping insurance. Let me just tell you, they're now anticipating, the editor of Lloyd's List, which I get every day, yesterday sent a stunningly sober account of how it looks like world trading routes are very, very severely going to change. If 35,000 Houthis can do this, the cost of shipping goes up. So really interesting potential. So geopolitics comes down to, can food move? Okay, gas, petrol, oil. We saw the question earlier about fertilizer prices. This is absolutely serious politics. The assumption that's questioned for Britain is that we always say, well, we're rich, we can buy food. What if you can't? Politics. Well, Brexit's been really successful, hasn't it? It's actually been terrible. Trade has gone down, difficulties, delays. Where does that hit? Cold, chilled, frozen goods, precisely what we're talking about in terms of access. Growers in mainland Europe saying, why should we bother to supply the British? It's very nice to have someone from the Netherlands here. These are very important. If you read Rachel Reeves's speech given at my university last week, which is a rivetingly important speech, one of the good things she said is we cannot go on with bad relations with Europe any longer. This has got to be sorted out. We get 30% of our food from the European Union, but pretend we're not part of it anymore. Fourthly, the really nasty stuff. After Crimea, moves went on in the Crimea being invaded by Russia in 2014, namely annexed from Ukraine. Big discussions went on in the UN Security Council, ending up in 2018 with Resolution 2417, which I'm sure you've all read. Let me tell you, I have, and it says we will not weaponize food ever again. Okay, Russia signed it. Okay, 4 years later, Russia flouted it by bombing Ukraine's entire facilities at Mariupol and then Odessa for its grain exports. And Ukraine provides food for 55 countries. That's 1/4 of all the countries in the world. So food is being weaponized. Whatever you think of what's going on in Hamas, Israel, etc., what's going on in Gaza now is mega in terms of weaponization. But Israel didn't sign, is not a member of the UN resolution. So these are the history of Britain, by the way, is not good in terms of weaponizing. We blockaded countries. We've created famines. The Bengal famine, if any of you, you're all from Britain, just listen to the Radio 4 series called 3 Million. 10, I think it's 10, 15-minute programs just running at the moment, coming to its end now, about the Bengal famine in 1942 to 43. Basically, we knew it was going on and we didn't respond to it. So Britain's record's not good. Food being weaponized, socioeconomic divisions, Joanna said that, the labour crisis, Simon's talked that, so I won't do it. And basically, to summarize, where we are at the moment in Britain, if you look at it, is horticulture is sitting in the middle of a food polycrisis, what in my world we call a polycrisis. Not one crisis, not climate change, it's not labour, it's not inequalities, it's multiple crises. So you could call it a multi-crisis. The phrase that's being used from academics is polycrisis. Okay, so what are the options for horticulture? Let's come down to horticulture again. I think option one is do nothing. Carry on drifting, carry on grubbing out, carry on all the difficulties, carry on getting fed by the Dutch as long as they're kind enough to do so, but actually mostly the Spanish. 4 countries basically provide most of the food imports from the EU. The thought of importing Florida citrus fruit as opposed to from Southern Europe or Morocco, well, you're entering there very expensive shipping costs. But we can call it maintain the business as usual, BAU. It means horticulture remains marginal. Option 2, radical relocation. Start planning to move uphill. I said, I'm born in Lincoln. next to the cathedral, so on a hill. But my childhood, when I came back from living in India, we used to go to the fens. I love the fens. It's below sea level. The cost of looking after things below sea level is going up. The danger and the volatility of seas, of climate, of weather, of storms is going to make retreat more and more likely. That's being planned for, let me tell you. I'm sure you know. We abandon the fens to go where? Get more food from the Netherlands? Actually, we should be moving uphill. The radical relocation argument is move uphill. Start planning different places to grow. It's not impossible. It's not the ideal, but it's perfectly possible. It requires something very, very different. Maybe go uphill and go near towns. Option 3 is that you do what is called bioregional. Resilience comes from diversity, not from concentration. I won't explain great expense of this in my report. From 1964, when Paul Baran at the Rand Institute said, looking at telecommunications, if you have one hub that is the power broker of everything in the system, if you knock out that hub, the whole system collapses. So therefore, decentralize. And actually, the deep extent is have completely distributed systems. So no hub of any significance at all. In other words, you have 20 hubs for England, 4 for Wales, 3 for Scotland, so on. So you have a radical decentralization. It's not going to happen, but that becomes bioregionalism. It's a distinct possibility for 21st century end. That requires food belts around towns, hence my trip to Belgium. You see that now re-emerging in Liège, in Leuven, in Ghent. You see that in small towns in France. You actually see it extensively in France since the 2014 law passed by the French government that all towns should redevelop connections with their rurality. So reconnection of the urban-rural is really interesting. Joanna, you would love it. The eco-city bioregional model sounds fanciful, but is no more fanciful than the mess that we're creating now. I'm getting there. Option 4, Dysonism. It has great advantages if you're a billionaire. If you've got very big capital and can get returns from it and scale, it can work. But as I asked Simon, the most people I talk to about that, the difficulty is where's the biodiversity? Do you have absolute intensification in big sheds or big greenhouses with feedback loops of your waste producing the power that you use and generating more waste that turns into power and trying to get closed loop circular economies into one landholding? Well, you can do that, but it leaks. And where's the biodiversity? Well, you say, well, you have the biodiversity around that. So you have the land sparing argument, not land sharing. You don't have biodiversity in the field or in the garden or in the horticulture. You have it elsewhere. So you intensify and then have your biodiversity elsewhere. That's interesting. Probably one of the things that could take off is vertical farming, possibly because it's urban. But I don't see that personally. You're shaking your head at the back. I don't see that either. Not on. I looked in the Netherlands 10 years ago. I was involved in discussions about that. There was a lot of excitement in the Netherlands, but it's gone. The US is still fantasizing about it. Option 5, ultra specialization. It's a version. Dysonism is a version. Horticulture just becomes a little niche bit. All food comes from factories. Doesn't matter where the ingredients come from, and you have some token diversity at the edge of the plate. I haven't quite worked out what that would look like. And option 6 is what's emerging around the world in sort of community self-development, growth of allotments, people's horticulture, a rebirth of peri-urbanism. Not sure what that could be, but there is a lot of that going on in Britain. A lot of that going on in Wales, actually, of all places. It's not the fens. Okay, what does this all imply? Where are we? Let's wrap up. I think the first message I've got, look at it, I've tried to, when Rosemary asked me, I said I would look a really big view. I hope this is roughly what you might have expected. I think the first thing is that horticulture is actually, whatever agencies and bodies there are in horticulture, now is the time for them to get together and do not the National Food Strategy, the plan, but horticulture, the plan. And you're not going to get that from government. It's got to be done by everyone except government. One of my favorite theories of policy making is you do that, and then you know it's going to be thrown into the garbage can. It's called the garbage can theory of policy. And then come a crisis, ministers run around like headless chickens and say, I've got to do something. And the civil servants reach into the garbage can and pull out, say, what about this, minister? Okay. It happens. It happens. So I can see the point of doing horticulture, the plan, simply for that, because the likelihood of crises is growing, not diminishing. Secondly, I think there's a really important thing, and I love Simon's talk for that, a real excitement about rethinking the agri-food education sector. I think that horticulture, the plan should be really big thinking and think about land grant type colleges everywhere across the UK. They were there from the 1880s, actually, and they've been dismantled or incorporated into universities and put on the ref treadmill. We actually have got to say, let's reconnect. Instead of just being horticulture, let's have agri-food colleges. So a catering college may actually be more important to engage with horticulture and merge with horticulture, wherever it is. Option 3 is, and Simon was saying this very beautifully, and more, a broader approach to innovation. The thing I would add, he was saying it actually in his talk, if you listen to him, it's not just about the robots, it's about the plant physiologists, it's about the people. Absolutely. Getting the social injected into the technical education is really key. We could talk about that more. Fourth, is we need to get intelligence onto the agenda for the public. We've got to start having different messages for the public about the importance of gardening. There are more gardeners in Britain than there are horticulturists. The expansion of the gardening sector is enormous. We've got people from Garden Organic here, you know, the RHS, the Garden Organics, these are really important. Really, really important. How could that be expanded? What would it look like? But I think the most likely is the 5th. Well, I would say that because I spent 1.5 years obsessively looking at the state of British government resilience planning, which is very interesting, by the way, it's very good, but it's hopeless when it comes to food. There is not a bit of thinking about food in resilience planning at all. You said what? A comment from the front. We'll get to the questions. He's not asleep, definitely. You can't see his face. I can. I think we need national and local horticulture strategies because they become very important indicators of resilience preparedness and how seriously we take the people, not just protecting the powerful. That requires health being at the center of it. So what Joanna was saying is absolutely spot on. The sloppy politics that we've got at the moment actually get a wake-up call. And that's it's beginning to happen. Please read Rachel Reeves's speech, the MAIS, M-A-I-S lecture. Look it up and read it. It's 11 pages, dense reading. This is the most important statement anyone from Labour has said for a long time. They've said nothing, okay? They're so frightened of being criticised. But that speech is worth looking at. Why? Because it talks about food security in it. Horticulture becomes really, really important in resilience planning. Everywhere, not just Britain. Who cares about Britain? We're a small island. It's us. It's where I live, where you live, maybe. But it's the same everywhere. The thinking that I'm looking at applies everywhere. And part of the implication, I think, is we need a new narrative for horticulture in resilience. Looking through World War II planning around horticulture, which I do and have, you come across really astonishing, clear, simple messages about people, about eating, how they do, not wasting, cooking sensibly, creation of British restaurants, preparing to feed the masses well, nutrition becoming the dominant issue, and so on. But you get messages like Abraham Games's famous poster, use spades, not ships. Just think about that. Use spades, not ships. What would our equivalent now be when we're saying don't dig? What would the no dig equivalent of that 1942 campaign? Use spades, not thing. So I think the Food Foundation that Joanna referred to actually gets this. It does completely get this agenda. One message is to be child-centered. Well, if you don't follow it, their Veg Power campaign is really, really interesting and rich and effective, but terribly under-resourced. A possible message would be survivalist. I'm against survivalism, it becomes individualism. To survive, we need horticulture. That's quite interesting. Message number 3, public health. Joanna gave it, you know, do you quit UPFs, eat real plants, cook yourself? Always have your messages in 3, by the way. Quit UPF, no UPFs, eat real plants, cook yourself. Not eat yourself, cook yourself. New message 4, you get more nutrients per square meter from horticulture than anything else. I like that. New message 5, it begins with what goes onto your plate. I'm trying to think public. Message 6, appealing to macho young men, to be strong, eat your veg. If you didn't know it, have any of you seen the film The Game Changers? It's been watched by 2.5 billion people. Arnold Schwarzenegger, James Cameron, and someone else. I was in it. So that's why I know about it. It was basically an extraordinary story. I can tell you about it later, but just look it up. You can get it on things. It's basically about how this guy with actually a British guy, it's not a fiction, it's real, it's interviews, discovered that Roman centurions didn't eat meat diets. They mostly ate vegetarian diets. And he couldn't understand how you could be strong and a killer if you ate vegetarian. And so it unpicks this, and it ends up with changing the diet of baseball players and people like that, and they suddenly become healthier and better. And you've got an extraordinary interview with Arnold Schwarzenegger at the end. So it's worth watching just for that. But that was appealing to all the young kids in my street, the Macau young men, aged from 14 to 19. They all started knocking on my door and saying, "Are you the person who's in that film?" They were all watching it because it was about sex appeal. It was really extraordinary. And messages about the environment, cut the pollutants, live simply, and so on. So the messaging, I don't get any messages from horticulture. Joanna, come on. This is what you should come up. Different culturally appropriate messages. What are they? You know? So to conclude, I think we're scientists, we're academics. My report has 624 references that I've gone through, but 60 interviews, 10 national case studies, and so on. It's meticulous, okay, well, as good as we can get. But evidence isn't what wins arguments. It's evidence plus, and it's the plus bit I've been trying to get at. The public messaging is not good from us. I speak as a very keen gardener and an ex-field crop person. Our messages about growing and eating are too holier than thou. They're not working. I think we've got to accept that needs work. We've got to accept that horticulture is a multidisciplinary endeavor. Wonderful though applied biologists are, you need social scientists. You should be working with them in entirely integrated ways. I know good people are. We need a plan. I'm going to come back. That's the big idea I had for this. I think we need a horticulture plan, ignoring government, but thinking about what if a government did ever want it. We need to actually deal with the economic issue. People in the Treasury have said to me, why do we need to grow anything here? We can buy it. They're living in a fantasy world. They don't understand the politics of the real world. Can you believe it? People in the Treasury saying that. They do. So I think we've got to actually link horticulture, the social element, into the ecological public health element. Okay, that's it. Stop.